Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, president of LPB.
And I'm Barry Irwin, president of the Council for a Better Louisiana. A recent global climate report finds that the past 12 months have been the warmest on record for the U.S. And with that heat has come drought. At the end of June, nearly 56% of the nation experienced moderate to severe drought conditions. Even here in the state, the Mississippi River level has dropped so much that saltwater is moving upriver, potentially threatening the water supply for New Orleans.
Yet water is still found in abundance in Louisiana. It covers over 17% of the state and lies buried in 11 aquifers benefiting nearly every parish. But each day, over 8 billion gallons of water are withdrawn from Louisiana's surface and groundwater supplies. Demands from industry and population growth are beginning to threaten quantity and quality. And neighboring states, thirsty for the resource, stand by eager to draw from our wells. Tonight, we explore what Louisiana can do to protect one of its most precious resources on H2Woe, Louisiana's water worries. For retired civil engineer Hayes Town, every glass of tap water is precious.
We formed this organization to try to save the water for future generations.
Town organized Baton Rouge citizens to save our water after doing research on the aquifer that provides the city with its drinking water.
We're pumping way too much water for the system to handle, so it's causing the salt water to intrude from the south faster and faster.
Due to years of heavy water withdrawal from the Southern Hills aquifer, its flow rate has changed. Salt water is now entering into formerly freshwater areas. Currently, the primary users are the water company and industry.
It's about 50-50 between industry and the public, each using about 80 million gallons of fresh drinking water a day. Georgia Pacific herself uses 40 million gallons of fresh drinking water a day, while ExxonMobil uses 22 million gallons of fresh drinking water a day.
Town says the city's supplier of drinking water has already established a Plan B.
The Baton Rouge Water Company bought property on the Mississippi River below LSU, just in case they have to use Mississippi River water. I'm very concerned about that, as they are, that that might come to pass. And then the people will pay 3 times as much for water that's 1/3 as good.
Concerns about saltwater intrusion from farmers and water company officials in his district drove New Iberia Senator Fred Mills to sponsor Senate Bill 532 this session.
The goal of Senate Bill 532 was to have an environmental impact study done when certain types of procedures are done to withdraw water from the Chico aquifer.
The Chico aquifer is the only freshwater source for 15 parishes in southwest Louisiana. A natural gas distribution company will be using 7 billion gallons of water from the aquifer over the next 5 years to expand salt caverns at Jefferson Island. Mills says not all of the withdrawn water can be naturally replenished.
So the concerns that people in my area have is, will it be a hindrance for the agricultural community? Will it hurt our water systems? Will it be enough water for economic development in the future? Because that is such a precious resource.
SB 532 didn't pass, Mills says, due to industry objections that it was an additional regulatory burden, something he doesn't dispute.
I do agree with him, but for this specific purpose and this specific use, the people that I represent felt that this was something that they wanted, and I totally agree with them on it.
Nearly 1/4 of the state's groundwater usage is by industry. Besides the water's high quality, Jim Wilkins with the Louisiana Sea Grant Program says the price is right.
Groundwater is basically free for the taking. Any owner of land can drill a well and take basically as much water as they want.
It wasn't until 2003 that safeguarding the state's groundwater supplies became a statewide responsibility, given to the Department of Natural Resources Office of Conservation. Gary Snellgrove works in its environmental division.
state law does provide for our agency to issue an order to operators to either restrict production or limit production in a means that will maintain sustainability of the aquifer in the regional area where they're withdrawing from, and to also to prevent or mitigate issues such as saltwater encroachment.
This became necessary in 2008 at the height of the Haynesville shale activity when wells began running dry around the Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer in North Louisiana. The process of hydraulic fracturing or fracking by gas exploration companies was drawing approximately 5 million gallons of water per job. The Commissioner of Conservation sent an advisory encouraging the use of surface water.
In tracking this information, what we have found is that although in the beginning of the Haynesville shale activity in 2008, there was a heavy reliance upon the aquifer system, what we see now is approximately 77% of water being used for frac supply is coming from surface water resources.
The increased draw on surface water supplies prompted the Attorney General to issue opinions holding that these bodies are public things and can't be given away. The legislature followed suit in 2010 by passing Act 955 that put a per-gallon price on surface water. Jim Devitt is deputy counsel for DNR.
It also allowed the industry to show some other form of compensation to the state, and so they have an option to either pay or demonstrate a benefit to the state by means of economic benefits such as jobs and taxes.
Industries enter into a cooperative agreement with the state once it's given consent to the surface water usage. The program is voluntary, but participation ensures compliance with recent Attorney General decisions. Wilkins is concerned that if large-scale uses of surface water are allowed for one purpose, it may be impossible to restrict it for others.
Wherever there are a lot of people have a compelling need for water, such as Houston, there are going to be arguments that people will listen to justify why they should have some of the water that passes through this state.
As recently as 2010, Texas interests were in negotiations with the Sabine River Authority to purchase Toledo Bend water for 99 years. After objections from the community and the governor's office, the plan was suspended. For the half of the state that gets its drinking water from surface water sources, water quality is also a concern.
Even though the state waters are better now than they have been in over 50 years and still improving, I'd have to rate them as still needs improvement.
Chris Peeler is with the Department of Environmental Quality, which enforces the federal Clean Water Act. Peeler says mercury, nitrogen, and phosphorus are the primary pollutants in our surface waters. DEQ has established source reduction programs and is working with upstream partners to decrease the chemicals' presence. Ultimately, Peeler says when it comes to water pollution, we can all claim some responsibility.
The very activities that we do in creating new subdivisions, building new homes, farms and fields, cattle and chickens and hogs and pigs, as well as dogs and cats as well. When it rains, all of that material, those pollutant sources, get into our water bodies.
As demands on its water continues to increase, Louisiana must be vigilant in its stewardship, sustaining the resource while preserving the culture that depends on it.
Joining us in our studio to discuss water issues in the state are Baton Rouge area residents who were recruited and surveyed for us by LSU's Public Policy Research Lab. We're also joined by members of the Legislative Youth Advisory Council and Baton Rouge Citizens to Save Our Water. And welcome to everyone here. Let's start by reviewing some of the survey responses from that LSU study. When asked if they agreed with limited groundwater being free for the taking while more abundant surface water is charged for, the majority of respondents, 47%, think groundwater should be charged for, while surface water should be free. 27% of those surveyed recommend charging for the use of both, while 16% were comfortable with the way things are. When asked their support for selling state reservoir waters to other states, such as Texas, opponents outnumber supporters by just 1 percentage point. 44% of respondents are against the idea, while 43% support such a sale. 13% were unsure, and 5% didn't have an answer. And when the issue of fracking came up, nearly 3/4 of those surveyed, 71%, support the option of a parish being allowed to restrict the process even if the state has approved the company's permit. 23% of respondents oppose the move, indicating that state agencies can best manage Louisiana's groundwater concerns. So let's start there. When it comes to surface water and groundwater, who should control it? Who should be in charge of the water in our state? Anybody have any thoughts? Hayes?
The state government should be in charge of it. They have the resources and ability, and it's a statewide situation. You can't restrict it just to a city or a parish. You need a broader scope.
What happens when an individual community feels like, we don't have control of the whole water in our area? How do you balance those things out?
We have to go to the legislators and get the legislators to affect state government.
I mean, we talked earlier, you had some thoughts about that from some of your experiences, kind of along the same lines, but you look even larger to the federal government, right?
Yes, I mean, water is a connected body and the earth is a connected thing. You can certainly have local policies that define what you want done with your resources, but if the folks around you are polluting their groundwater tables, it's all going to seep in. And so we have to have a larger sense of ownership, not only who has the right to the water, but who has the responsibility for the water. And it's our land and it's our water, and we have to be collectively responsible for it.
Well, I have to kind of ask all of y'all, just starting off with some of this too, how many of you had thought a lot about water? I mean, in Louisiana, we're surrounded by water. Water's everywhere. We hear about drought in so many other places, and when we go a few days without rain, we feel like it's a drought. But how many of y'all have ever really thought about water as a real issue in our state?
I didn't think it was a real issue in our state. At the same time, I felt that it was a resource that we needed to conserve. I actually preserve all of the water I use for washing dishes, or if I'm washing greens, I take the water from my greens and pour it into my garden. I take the water from the dishes and pour it into my compost pile. I've always realized it was a valuable resource, but because we get so much rain here, I've never looked at it as a resource that we were going to lose totally.
Well, that sounds familiar. My wife pours the dog's water bowl from the water bowl, the clean water, into our plants as well. What about you, Dwayne? Have you thought about water? Do you think that we have shortages, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, I've thought about it for many years now. It's not something that just happened yesterday. This has been going on for quite a while, and if you look all over the world, there's shortages, not just in the drought areas now, but there's, in every continent, it seems like there's water shortages and droughts. And the main thing I'm concerned with is the water's being polluted, not only the groundwater, but the surface water also. I think we have a big problem with both of them.
Who's to blame, or who's to take responsibility for our water issues in the state? Is it us? Is it everybody? Is it a mixed thing, or is there somebody that's more responsible than others? Greg, what do you think?
I think it's definitely a mixed blame, and Chris Peeler in the opening piece talked a little bit about that. Everybody shares a little bit from a non-point source pollution standpoint. We all have a bit of a burden that we have to take. I know in East Baton Rouge Parish, if you look in every waterway, every time we have a rain in East Baton Rouge Parish like we had this afternoon, our waterways become conduits for garbage that's left in parking lots and in other areas. So we all share a little bit of that burden.
JH?
Well, I've been around water all my life, but Mr. Town and I, a year or two ago, got concerned about groundwater. He brought up the subject, and we got to looking into it. And from that day till today, we've been terribly concerned about our ability to have drinking water in the future for this community. The head on this water has gone down something like 250 feet since the 40s, and no more artesian wells, and industry's using so much of it that, our thought is sooner or later industry's got to get into the Mississippi River like everything south of Baton Rouge is, and we're going to have to preserve the groundwater for drinking purposes, else our children and grandchildren are going to be drinking water out of the river like New Orleans.
Uday, let me ask you, as a young person here in our state, and we're talking about an issue that's really a present issue, but really a future issue too. Have you ever given it much thought? Do you have any thoughts?
Not as much thought, I guess I should have, but I do have to agree with Mr. Gregg. If all of us are using water for daily sustenance and usage, we should all be taking responsibility to make sure that we can sustain it for the long term. Baton Rouge has some of the best tasting water ever, anywhere, in my opinion. I would like to keep that for myself when I'm an adult as well.
Eleanor, let me ask you too, since you're one of our young students thinking about the future and a Louisiana native.
My thoughts are the same as Uday's. We are all responsible, and even if we're brushing our teeth, we need to turn off the water, because I want my children to have the benefits of all the water that I have.
Well, let me ask you this. You know, sometimes when we think and hear about brownouts and power outages around the country, there are people that are on priorities. They have rolling blackouts or brownouts. Different things are done by things to set priorities for people. Even in other states, they're looking at some issues where there is a priority user for water. Any thoughts about that for here in Louisiana? We've got large industry that really is very dependent on water in a lot of different ways, and yet at the same time, we all need water. Agriculture needs water. Do you think that we ought to have agencies that begin to start setting priorities for where the water is used first if we get into drought or difficult situations? Rancy?
Well, it seems to me that may become a priority, and also I'm concerned about how soon we as a state need to take action, because it sounds like a pretty frightening future for the state if we don't act now.
Who does have, do you have any thoughts about who has priority? I mean, drinking water obviously is critical, but again, we have industry. Or how do you think we ought to be doing that?
Drinking water first.
What about agriculture?
You won't have anybody working out there if you don't have any water to drink.
What about agriculture?
Well, agriculture needs water too, but the industry is the big problem with the groundwater here. And the Mississippi River sitting out there with zillions of gallons of available water. And everything south of the interstate here in Baton Rouge, where the fault is using river water for industry. And the problem is Baton Rouge North are taking out the aquifer that we're trying to get drinking water out of. And that's what needs to happen. We need to convert industry north of the fault to river water, which they could do fairly easily.
Avni, let me ask you something too. We had talked earlier about your experience with your father-in-law actually in India and having to do water planning for the city of Bombay, which is a large city, probably larger than our state. That was far out planning. That was multi-year, way into the future planning. Do you see that same kind of thing going on in our state and in our country?
I think we don't, and we have this aura of invincibility about us, really, that perhaps needs to be shattered a little bit for us to think in the long term. For instance, we were just talking at home the other day. Not so long ago, we had the Mississippi at 100-year flood level. We were letting water through the spillways. We were inundating floodplain land. And here we are 6 months later in drought conditions. And so maybe there's a case for trying to manage some of those resources, keeping the water when we have a surplus, using it later. We have a system of dams and lakes that serve Bombay. What they do is in the monsoons, when we have the deluges, they fill up the reservoirs, and then over time that's what's piped to the residents, and you have a continuous replenishment cycle. It takes a lot of capital investment, it takes a lot of planning. The geography certainly helps, but I think you first have to have a sense of having a limited resource that you are responsible for shepherding. And then once that feeling sets in, everything else tends to follow. It's when you have a feeling of invincibility, when you feel that no matter when you turn the tap on, you will always have water at full pressure. That's perhaps where the problem is.
And it's kind of hard for us, I think, in Louisiana to think that way when we obviously have water when we turn on the tap, exactly. And we have water all around us, especially we used to worry more about flooding a lot of times than we did about drought.
I think as long as it's continuously raining, a lot of people cannot perceive of the possibility that we could run out of water. So I think a major educational effort needs to start.
Well, hold your thoughts for just a second, because that's all the time we have for on this portion of our show. When we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further explore Louisiana's water issues. So stay with us. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're discussing some of the issues facing our state's waters. Joining us now is our panel of experts. First, Senator Gerald Long is a Republican from Winfield. He successfully co-authored legislation this session to strengthen the Groundwater Resources Commission and toughen regulations on the sale of surface water from the Toledo Bend Reservoir. Don Briggs is president of the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association, which represents the exploration and producing sectors operating in the state. He's also an appointee of the governor to the Groundwater Management Advisory Task Force. Karen Gautreaux is Director of Government Relations for the Louisiana chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Karen has served in environmental policy positions with the administrations of Governors Romer, Edwards, Foster, and Blanco, including as Deputy Secretary of DEQ in 2004. And Commissioner Jim Welsh is the Commissioner of Conservation for the Department of Natural Resources. He took the job in 2002 after 36 years of state service. A trained geologist, Commissioner Welsh was a key player in drafting the state's groundwater management plan. So before we go to our audience questions, I just want to start with each of our panelists and just kind of start with a general question. But Senator Long, when you talk about water issues facing our state, what do you think are the biggest challenges we're facing right now?
Well, thank you, Barry, and thanks to the audience for being here. It's extremely important that Louisiana develop a comprehensive water management program. We are one of only 9 states that does not have a water management program. It's very important, it's very essential that if we're going to manage this valuable resource, that we develop a plan. The state of Oklahoma is the most recent state that has done that. It took 4.5 years to craft that plan so that it met the needs of business and industry, the farming community, the public. My bill, which we passed this past session, 495, Senate Bill 495, will create a water management study which will eventually lead to the first comprehensive water management program. With that being said, the only thing I would add is that while we have been blessed, we need to be good stewards of what we have.
Don Briggs with the oil and gas folks. I know you're not a water guy, you're an oil and gas guy, but you really, I know you're very concerned and it's a sensitive issue for you. How do y'all fit in? How does that industry fit into the question?
First of all, I supported this bill, and that's an important thing. And but we're in the oil and gas sector, so consequently, using water for hydraulic fracturing has been a big part of our work that we've done, and mostly in North Louisiana. And so that's important to us, and how that is managed and how we develop that. We had a lot of issues with the Haynesville Shale when it first developed, and as you know, now we use 77% of it. Actually, it's a little bit higher than that now because we use other water. We use surface water now compared to the groundwater. So I agree with Gerald. A comprehensive plan that works for everyone, it works for all the industries, is a good thing, and one we need to continue to work on.
Karen Gautreaux with the Nature Conservancy, what about you?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we see, as everyone else recognizes, is competing uses for that same resource. People are increasing the demand of quantity, whether it's for agriculture, environmental flows, municipalities, and we have a limited supply, and unfortunately that increase in quality can contribute to the loss, increase in quantity can increase the problems associated with water quality. And I think one of the classic examples for us is the not only drought-induced salinity changes along the coast, but when people upstream divert the water that could be used for the coastal ecosystems. As one example, we see some pretty dire consequences in Louisiana, and we are at the bottom of a big system, and I think it's very important that we implement this comprehensive strategy because there are people above us that are making plans for that water as well. So it's very important that we have a good idea of how we want to manage our resources.
Commissioner, where does DNR fit into this, Department of Natural Resources?
Well, as a regulator, there's no doubt in my mind the most important thing that we need to do now is to develop an adequate monitor system for the water, the various aquifers in the state. Without monitor wells, we have no idea what the results of our efforts in managing the aquifers are. recently DNR has entered into a $2.7 million contract with the U.S. Geological Survey to drill some additional monitor wells. It may result in about 200 additional wells, monitor wells drilled in the state, and we think that's a real statement for the state moving forward to enhance the overall regulatory program.
I wanted to go straight now to some of our audience questions, and some of the things you mentioned actually were topics that some of our other folks brought up. I want to start with Richard over here, who we were talking earlier, had kind of a little different take on some of these questions. Richard, what were your thoughts?
I'm curious if we work with Homeland Security in protecting our water supply. We have the natural disasters, and we also have man-made disasters with industrial misuse, pollution, but the security of our water supply, do we have a plan for that? A backup plan should something occur?
Well, I think the best way to approach that is that if we do not have a plan, we need to become proactive. We do not have a policing system. And I think that is one of the problems within our state, is that we have, for example, we have 29 levee boards in Louisiana. And we have a lot of people doing a lot of different things, but we do not have a one voice. And your concerns are quite valid, and I believe that honestly that's an issue that legislatively that we can address.
I was going to say, does anybody know, just off the top of their head, if that is one of the concerns? We do deal so much with the environmental issues and certainly the quantity issues. Is terrorism one that we've given some thought to when it comes to water supply? Do you know, in terms of DNR, have they done that, Commissioner?
Well, not
your exact area.
Not in this exact area.
You're not Homeland Security.
But let me just say that in developing statewide plans of any nature, public input is so important, and that is a very valid issue. And I'm sure that would be a proper comment, and that the developers of the plan will certainly take that seriously and include such provisions in the plan.
That's one maybe we need to get from State Police or GOSEP and
Yeah.
DEQ. Some of our students had some questions. You brought up the issue about saltwater, and I think, Eleanor, you had a question about saltwater, and so did Uday. So, Eleanor, what were you talking, or what were you thinking about in terms of the saltwater issue?
Well, I know that California and Florida both use desalination as one of the main sources of their fresh water. And with the excess of natural gas that we have, could we use that source of energy to fuel desalination plants?
And desalination, by that we mean to take the salt out of the waters. Yeah. Is that an option, or is it something?
It's something, certainly one I haven't thought about, but I would think without question that would be a great power source for it, because we have such an abundance of natural gas today compared to where we were in 2008. We were importing, and now we're looking at exporting natural gas. So I would think, I have no idea how much natural gas a desalination plant would take, but I would think it'd be a good use of some of the natural gas that we have.
And I'm not sure that will ever become something that, feasibly speaking, will become practical. When we look at the abundance of fresh water that we have, the amount that flows through the Atchafalaya Basin, the amount that flows through the Red River, the Atchafalaya, obviously the Mississippi River. Just to give you an example, though, of one of the caveats in managing water, Toledo Bend has 186,000 acres. In a typical normal year, when rainfall is predictable, 90% of that water travels south through diversion canals and finally ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. We've got to be good stewards of managing what we have, whether it's through the creation of reservoirs or whether it's through the creation of better management. But we have an abundance of fresh water. There may be a time that we look at converting salt water, but I think right now what we're looking at is how can we manage what we have. Certainly you're thinking outside the box, and that's what we would expect a student to do. And thank you for the question.
Well, Uday had a different question, but dealt with the same thing, but you were talking about saltwater intrusion as a question, as an issue.
Yes, although you were saying that we do have abundances of fresh water, we can't ignore the fact that saltwater is mixing into into freshwater sources. My question was, what steps are being taken by government agencies to prevent saltwater intrusion into these freshwater sources that we as a community use?
Commissioner?
One of the things that we look at when we approve the drilling and use of water wells is the possibility of saltwater intrusion. It's a common thing, especially in South Louisiana, as you approach the coastal areas. Almost every aquifer that you can name, if you go far enough south or down dip, as geologists say, you're going to find that the bottom of these aquifers have naturally occurring salt water. So you have to be extremely careful when you're exploiting water close to the coastline. You do not want to screen your well too deep in the aquifer, because salt water tends to stay at the bottom of the aquifer, and if you get too close, you will certainly draw that salt water into your well.
And that was a concern that both Hayes and JH brought up earlier about that in the Baton Rouge area. I mean, do you have any questions for any of those or any points?
I'd like to ask the commissioner a question. Isn't it true that your job, one of your jobs according to the law, is to manage the water resource for the benefit of the citizenry? And second, if that's true, why haven't we done something besides make studies for the last 40 years?
Excellent questions. Let me just go back in history a little while. When I was in school at LSU in the late 50s, that far back, it was known that salt water was moving across the Baton Rouge Fault. It was moving across the fault because of the pumpage north of the fault, creating low pressure areas and things like that caused the salt water south of the fault to move north of the fault. In 1974, the legislature created a commission, a special commission to address this issue, the Capital Area Groundwater Commission. For the last 35 or so years, the capital area has been studying that situation. They've taken certain actions over this period, and what we have now is continued encroachment of salt water across the fault. The problem is still there. What recently, the Commissioner of Conservation has received some authority to regulate groundwater in Louisiana, and that's where we come in. We've had several public hearings on the situation in the Baton Rouge area, and we've issued an order that has put a new management plan for the Baton Rouge aquifer in effect. The order we issued has already started this plan. What we are going to do is the U.S. Geological Survey has developed a model, or is developing a management model, especially for the Baton Rouge aquifer. This is the first time this has ever been done. So this model will help us manage this aquifer using science. That's never happened before.
Let me move on here, because we're talking about the issue here in Baton Rouge, but there are also some issues in North Louisiana as well. More recently, obviously, the fracking issue has come up, but really, if you go back a long time before that happened, there were concerns. We heard them in the legislature about the Sparta aquifer, trying to make sure that was replenished. Senator Long, do you have some thoughts or some insight into what that situation is there? Because it is different between North and South Louisiana.
Yeah, it is, and I bring you a good report in that some of the issues that we looked at 15, 20 years ago are beginning to be addressed in a tangible, constructive way. I do want to mention this because you mentioned the fracking and the amount of water that it takes. We have drilled, and certainly Mr. Briggs is obviously far knowledgeable, but serving as the chairman of Natural Resources, we see these numbers. When we converted primarily from groundwater to surface water, most of our concerns engaged with water begin to simply be managed by the use of surface water. Now, one of the concerns that we have to have, though, is the continual monitoring of what we do with drilling. And I want to tell you, the oil and gas industry has stepped up big in doing the right thing. I just returned from a trip to Vermont representing the state at another conference. Vermont is the first and only state that has outlawed fracking. When I asked the legislators there, why did this vote become so popular and why did you outlaw it? The only answer I got, and Barry, this is really important because I think it addresses some of our concern, those legislators said we were afraid of the unknown. I want the public to know in Louisiana, we've created a great partnership with oil and gas. And I want to tell you, they have been good stewards of what we've asked them to do. We're going to continue to monitor that for the benefit of our people. But I think we can actually say that our aquifers today in North Louisiana are in much better shape than they would have been 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, Donnie, do you want to comment on that as well?
No, I just want you, I didn't pay him to say that.
But y'all have been working in partnership even in other areas of the state,
that's right.
trying to
that's
do
exactly
things.
right. And you know, and of course on the use of the hydraulic fracturing in water, in the beginning we were testing all those wells in North Louisiana and getting a feel for the science of it and what we needed to, how much water, how much sand and this type of thing. And then we did draw down some water wells in local areas like that and created some problems. But then we immediately started shifting off and using surface water, but we also, instead of groundwater, we also use produced water from other wells in the Cotton Valley that produce oil, but they produce a lot of salt water with them. So we use that and we recycle it, and we create. We're using water from a lumber company up there and recycling that and cleaning it up and using it. So.
And you've worked kind of with the local government in the H2Woe area too. Isn't that true as well? So there's some work going on there.
Well, in H2Woe, they have in the Tuscaloosa Marine Shell, there's 18 wells and there's 3 rigs drilling right now, and they were concerned about the efforts that took place in North Louisiana. So they did come up with some ordinances, and then we worked with them and explained to them how we're doing it, and we're not using any surface or groundwater actually in H2Woe.
So it does sound like there's a lot of interaction going on between the industry and between the regulators.
Absolutely.
Beatrice, I haven't been able to get you in for a while, but I know you had some questions about things. Would you like to go ahead?
Well, I'm mainly concerned with the number of stations that we have to gauge water. I'm wondering if we've had a reduction in those stations that we've had in the past to gauge water levels and quality.
We've always considered the U.S. Geological Survey as the prime hydrologist in the state of Louisiana. They have had historically the monitoring system over the state on a statewide basis. The contract I mentioned that we have entered into with the USGS will allow them funding to install as many as 200 additional monitor wells in the 11 major aquifers of the state. And part of their contract is to decide where are those 200 wells best located, and they have the expertise to do that. So that, again, I think that is an excellent thing that we're moving forward and recognize the importance of groundwater in Louisiana.
Let me move on to another topic that's one that we've talked about a little bit here too, and that is, and Senator Long's been involved with this, the question about selling our water. And actually even the discussion about Mississippi River water, we heard, might be somehow diverted to other places in Texas and have them, to help out with drought situations. Let me start with you, Karen. I mean, you kind of, with Nature Conservancy, look at things as regionally and locally, but also kind of with a national perspective. What's kind of going on nationally when it comes to these water issues that with water that goes through individual states, but other states have needs? What's kind of the latest out there on that?
Well, I think that there is a lot of interest, not only during a drought time, but as there are metropolitan areas that are growing and understanding that water resources are very scarce, that they're passing laws to be able to divert water and do interbasin transfers and things like that. So we are working with a number of organizations and agencies to try to get a better handle not only on flows in Louisiana, but also working with policy people throughout the whole Mississippi River Basin.
What other kind of in other states just north of us, or do you have
right? For example, I'm trying to remember if it was South Dakota that passed a law this year to talk about how they wanted to divert water. And unfortunately, when we have a high flow episode that was referenced earlier, the Mississippi River reaching peak stages, some people try to make the case that they have all this excess water that's causing a problem for them down here, so wouldn't it be helpful to go ahead and divert some upstream? So they're increasingly, people are investigating compacts, they're looking at state laws to address their water quality and quantity concerns, and so we do nationally try to get a handle on different policies and hopefully bring some of this experience back to Louisiana. As a matter of fact, one of the things we're working on right now is trying to get a handle on environmental flows. That's kind of one of the things that's very obvious when we talk about our coast needing water supply, but there are a lot of demands on our streams, and unfortunately we haven't figured out in terms of habitat needs, which translates to a really important thing in Louisiana, the sportsman paradise. Sure. And communities, it's so connected, so we both try to stay connected nationally in policy as well as trying to contribute to an integrated policy in Louisiana.
Let me ask you one other thing, and you might not know the answer to that, but with all the flooding, we have these episodic things. Last year we had flooding, was flooding all up the northern river valleys and all that. Does that help them with their aquifers? Does that help replenish things, or is that
I think it depends. Senator Long was mentioning the condition of the Sparta. The Sparta, for example, and this is true throughout the United States, depending on the geology, is an aquifer that recharges very slowly. It can also depend how the water bodies are releasing their discharge. For example, one reason that we think we didn't have more severe flooding down the Atchafalaya spillway was we had been in a drought condition. So while we had record high levels on the river, we had drought conditions on the outside of that river, so it's very dependent on how the flooding takes place and where it takes place.
And Barry, if I might just make one comment. In the past session of the legislature, I introduced a second bill, Senate Bill 436, which restricts the sale of water from Toledo Bend. As you know, this became a hotly contested issue. What my bill simply says is that if the Sabine River Authority recommends it, it now must also have the recommendation of the 5 governing bodies, the Police Jury and the Joint Legislative Committee on Natural Resources. It is easier for the state of Texas to buy water from Louisiana than it is for them to sell their own water. Toledo Bend is jointly owned by Louisiana and Texas. Now that's interesting. Their regulatory requirements deal in a much more difficult way for them to move water, and that's why it was such an attractive thing. The problem is, who wants to commit to a 99-year contract not knowing from one year to the next whether or not that water will be needed in Louisiana? So I think the point is this: we're going to have to continue to be savvy and intelligent in regards to how we manage this asset. I believe this: in the next 10 to 15 years, we will talk about water as we talk about gas and oil today. It will be that essential to the growth and development of Louisiana in particular.
Nancy, I think you had a question, and then Uday.
Yes, I wanted to get back to fracking. I know there's been concern around the country where this process is ongoing about the safety of the drinking water within communities. And I was wondering how the water that is used in the process is being disposed of. Is it going to be disposed here or where? Well, you did mention that there was some kind of research. Yes, recycling.
Yeah. We do recycle a lot of the water, but eventually when we have to dispose of it, in other words, and when the well comes on and it brings a lot of that water back up, about a 40%, 50% of it comes back, and then we recycle it. And then if it gets to the point we can no longer recycle it, we dispose of it in underground injection wells, okay, that are far below the water aquifers, and which we have many in the state, is regulated by the Office of Conservation.
Uday, you had a question.
Yes. Ms. Karen was making points of states other than ours dealing with the Mississippi River. What role does the federal government play in such actions of diverting river water, which, if you divert so far up north, it will affect states south of that state in some form?
It's a good question. It's kind of where we were earlier, like who controls the water? Who does control the water when you're talking about those kind of state to state issues?
Well, it's interesting because it's the question is legitimate, but the answer is quite confusing because I don't really know that there is a clear-cut legal definition of who actually owns the water. If you deal with stationary water, there's one set of laws. If you deal with moving water, there's another set of laws. I can tell you this, in North Louisiana we have the Red River Waterway Commission, which regulates to some degree the activity along the river. But if you will, think with me for just a moment. Every great development that has taken place as you leave Canada and travel south, Minneapolis, all of the great cities, found their place because of the availability of water. So the movement of water is going to be a major issue. One of the reasons that the Red River is so much of a topic is that there seems to be less of a fluctuation in the depth of the Red River compared to others. But it's an ongoing question, and quite honestly, there are lawyers who are paid millions of dollars who are still trying to figure that question out.
In that case, you speak of making comprehensive plans for the future. How do these plans take into account what states do today that they didn't account for when they were written?
That's a great question, and as I mentioned a few moments ago when we started, the state of Oklahoma is the most recent state that has adopted a master plan for the management of water. It took 4.5 years for them to carve out that. It will take that long or longer in Louisiana because of the tremendous diversity of interests. Farmers right now, for example, the agriculture industry uses about 53% of all of our water resources. When you take our industries, in particular, when you look along the Mississippi River, Gautreaux Parish, and then when you begin to consider the needs of individuals, it is a complicated issue. But again, I make this statement: if we do not address it, then we're going to have to deal with the consequences of not having a plan that we can manage and that we can work with. It's going to be a long-term solution, though, and it's going to take some time.
How do you get citizen input into that? That's a process that is, it seems like there are a lot of processes that we're talking about and a lot of agencies that are involved in this. How do the citizens get their input into that?
Barry, Mr. Briggs sat on the Groundwater Commission, and they just released a phenomenal study of groundwater. Now the bill that I introduced, which we passed, Senate Bill 496, will create the Water Management Board. We'll have a commission of 25 members that represent all facets of Louisiana. And then in addition to that, there'll be an advisory board of 45 others. There'll be appointments from the governor's office, there'll be appointment from business, but we're actually going to start in September with organizational meetings to begin to move the state toward thinking in terms of water management. But the public input, someone mentioned this a few moments ago, I think it was the commissioner. Without the public input, we will miss a great deal of what we need to do. It's essential that the public become engaged in the management of water.
Do you expect hearings on this, or how will they
Absolutely.
find a way?
What I envision is that once we have this commission up and running, we're going to go to Shreveport, Louisiana. We're going to go to Houma, Louisiana, Baton Rouge, and we're going to go statewide, and we're going to ask our citizens, help us understand your needs and how we, as legislators and as members of the state of Louisiana working together, how we can address this issue, because it will be a very defining moment for our state in the days to come.
Let me ask Karen and the Commissioner maybe both this real quickly. How aware do you think citizens actually are about these issues? Again, we don't think of Louisiana as a place that is really without water, and yet we're hearing and talking about some very serious concerns, both kind of in the short term, but really for the long term as well. We've got a lot of governmental action that's begun to take place, but where do you think citizens are, and is there some education effort that's required on others' part to get that word out?
I think that typically when you have some type of challenge or a crisis situation like a drought or something that brings people's attention to it, they tend to pay more, such as the situation in Baton Rouge. It becomes more of something in the public's eye. I do think there's a tremendous amount of work to be done in Louisiana because, as you said, usually people are more worried about keeping water out of their homes than worried about it coming through a tap into their homes. So I think there's a tremendous role for education. I think just the potential for conservation is incredible, as well as innovative technologies. One of the things that was brought to mind by Senator Long's comments was some of the businesses on Sparta have developed some fairly innovative ways of recycling their water, and that innovation was driven by a crisis. So I do think, we have lots of positive public education. I think these public meetings and task force meetings, commission meetings will be a great opportunity, but I think we need to have a pretty comprehensive educational plan that goes along with the development of the water policy.
Commissioner, could you touch on what Karen was just talking about, that project up in West Monroe, I think, with the Sparta aquifer and how that worked out?
Yes, a company up there called Graphics Packaging has implemented a wastewater treatment system that, in lieu of using the Sparta water, which is a major aquifer, North Louisiana services about 16 parishes. They are going to use the wastewater from the city of West Monroe, therefore saving Sparta aquifer about up to 10 million gallons a day. And the deficit in the Sparta aquifer right now is about 18 million. So that's in itself is a very good thing. But I wanted to comment too on historically in Louisiana. I think most people, and especially the regulators, have focused on water quality, contamination, pollution. Only recently has the legislature, well, actually in 2001 and then again in 2003, we're focusing now on water quantity, making sure that the aquifers in the state are sustainable and that they can keep performing, and that's where the Office of Conservation has the authority to look at groundwater for the first time from that type of management viewpoint.
Let me run over here. I think Avni had a question that she had on her mind about something to one of the experts.
Sure. So just sort of continuing on the theme of citizen involvement, are there things that you would recommend or options that you would offer for citizens to be more involved proactively? Not really having to wait for a TV show to invite us here to get us thinking about water quality, but there are lobbies within the legislature. How do citizens organize, and where are the calls to action? What are the organization centers for us to get more involved and to take a stake in the future of our children's water?
This past year, I mentioned to you the proposed sale of Toledo Bend water. I attended a meeting at Cypress Bend on Toledo Bend Lake. 450 citizens from throughout the state of Louisiana became concerned about how this was being approached. They became proactive. Their voice became obviously very clear. And as a result of that, I took that as an important statement that managing water and engaging people and having the citizens involved, look, we don't have all the answers, I want to tell you. But when the citizens begin to speak with one accord and to express their opinion, if you want to get the attention of your legislator, begin to expect him to hear or for her to hear from you. When we hear from the public, I think it creates a natural response of wanting to do the right thing.
Yeah, Karen, from an organizational point of view that does deal with a lot of citizens.
We do. One thing that I was going to mention is, and it was a very important part of the effort to pass the water policy laws that the Commissioner mentioned, For example, there was an interfaith network. They initiated something called Ezekiel 34, and I think the point of that was it was statewide, and there are lots of organizations that can bring people in to speak. I don't think it's another avenue besides going to a public meeting to invite people in to talk to people. This bond of stewardship is very important, and I think offers a lot of opportunities.
We're just about out of time, but Don Briggs, from the point of view of the oil and gas industry and the involvement that you do have with all of these issues, any closing thoughts from what you've been hearing or thoughts you'd like to share on this? Well, I mean,
the oil and gas industry is, naturally, we want to be good stewards of the resources that we have here, and we intend to do that and have been doing it and will continue to do so, and support the efforts that that'll be coming up. We appreciate the fact we do have an issue with who owns the water on the surface, but without that getting into that, we certainly want to work with the legislators and the citizens on the use of the water.
Well, there's nothing like an issue like that to keep you engaged and involved in every legislative session that comes up, I suspect. Yeah. Well, we've pretty much run out of time for this segment of our program. I'd like to thank our panelists for participating here tonight, Senator Long, Mr. Briggs, Ms. Gautreaux, and Commissioner Welsh for their insight on this month's topic. When we come back, we'll have some closing thoughts in just a moment.
Well, Barry, the audience is engaging still with a lot of very interesting questions. We were talking about surprise about issues like homeland security being in the planning, and also countries like Israel who use water very wisely and well, and perhaps maybe we have some new issues to look at. Well, and also the technology opportunities, because as has been mentioned, when we have problems and we have challenges, obviously technology can come along and create another whole little industry that hopefully maybe we can be a part of as a state as well. And hopefully citizen input is sort of like everybody here on this show. We hope that you will join us with that input. That's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square, but we encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. And while you're there, take this month's survey, view extended interview clips, and volunteer to be on the show. We also encourage you to comment on tonight's program like viewers did following last month's encore presentation of Weighty Matters, Louisiana's obesity problem. L. Barnes writes, "The welfare program needs to be reworked for the better and stop allowing junk food to be purchased at the taxpayer's expense." And North Louisiana resident Cindy writes, "I live in the country near Saline, Louisiana. There's simply a lack of healthy eating establishments without driving 60 miles in any direction." And retired school teacher George writes, "Congratulations, staff, for an outstanding program. I do believe all junk food should be removed from campuses, and students should be required to do strenuous exercises outside or in the gym." Well, that's pretty tough love. Well, thanks, George, for the kind words, and to everyone who commented. We love hearing from you. And now, looking ahead to next time, a new anti-bullying state law goes into effect this coming school year. But is the statute too broad in its definition of bullying, or not inclusive enough? Louisiana Public Square goes on the road next month to explore bullying in Louisiana. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and good night. Good night, everyone.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.